Most anglers think losing catfish bait on the cast is about throwing the rod too aggressively or simply using a bait that is naturally too soft to hold. The truth is, the softness of the bait itself is rarely the primary failure point when you're fishing from the bank. The real issue is that most catfish rigs are built to fight the aerodynamics of the overhead cast and the hydrodynamics of the river current at the exact same time, and they fail at both. When a soft bait like chicken liver or fresh cut shad hits the surface of the water, the sudden deceleration forces the mass of the meat aggressively up the shank of the hook. If the hook has not been placed through the absolute toughest structural membrane of that specific bait, the water pressure strips it off before the weight ever reaches the bottom of the river. By the end of this video, you will have a specific, repeatable framework for rigging any soft bait so it survives the cast, holds steady in heavy current, and leaves the hook gap completely exposed for the strike. We are going to cover the hydrodynamic profile of cut bait, the specific anatomical anchor points you must find on soft baits, and how reading the current seam determines whether your presentation stays intact or washes away. Understanding these mechanics matters immensely because fishing with a bare hook is the most expensive and invisible mistake you can make on the bank. When your bait flies off mid-cast or washes off the hook during the descent through the water column, you almost never feel it happen through the rod blank. You set your rod in the bank holder, tighten the drag to the appropriate tension, and sit down in your chair to wait for a strike that is never going to come. 45 minutes go by, and you genuinely believe you are actively fishing the spot. In reality, you're just soaking a piece of empty steel in the river while the scent trail of your lost bait drifts further downstream, actively pulling the catfish away from your actual rig. This silent failure erodes your confidence, makes you second-guess perfectly good spots, and forces you to constantly reel in your line just to check if you still have bait. Every single time you retrieve your rig just to check the hook, you disrupt the delicate scent trail you were building and reset the clock on drawing a fish into your feeding zone. The angler who understands how to secure their bait perfectly casts one time, leaves the rig completely alone, and lets the olfactory column do the heavy lifting. Before you even open your cooler to bait the hook, the first critical question you have to ask on the bank is about the structure of the current in front of you. What is the water actually doing at the exact coordinates where the bait is going to land? Most bank anglers look at the surface of a river and assume the water is moving in one uniform, predictable direction from upstream to downstream. But the bottom of the river is essentially a turbulent mountain range of rocks, submerged logs, and deep depressions that violently interrupt that surface flow. If you cast a large, unaerodynamic chunk of soft bait directly into the heaviest main current channel, the hydraulic pressure is going to constantly push, pull, and spin the meat against the metal hook. Over a very short period of time, that relentless hydraulic drag widens the physical hole the hook made in the bait, and the meat simply slips past the barb and floats away. You have to actively scan the surface and find the current seam before you decide where to place your cast. A current seam is the visible, swirling boundary line where fast-moving main channel water meets slower, resting water behind a piece of physical structure or a bend in the bank. When your bait lands just inside the slower, protected side of that seam, it is no longer fighting the main tearing drag of the river current. Instead, the bait rests quietly in a pocket of low pressure, while its scent and amino acids are gently pulled out into the fast water to act as a directional highway for the catfish. The field test for finding this protected zone is incredibly simple and requires no bait at all. Cast a heavy sinker with a bare hook into what you believe is the soft side of the current seam. If your rod tip immediately starts bouncing and the sinker violently rolls downstream until it wedges into a snag, you miss the seam and hit the main drag. If the rod tip loads up smoothly and the sinker holds perfectly still with moderate tension on the main line, you have found the exact pocket where your bait will survive. Once you know the water flow will not tear your presentation apart, the next mandatory question is about the structural anatomy of the bait itself. Where is the strongest anchor point on this specific piece of meat? Anglers notoriously take a large circle hook and simply ball up a piece of chicken liver or cut shad by piercing it directly through the center of the softest tissue. Raw muscle meat has almost zero structural integrity when exposed to mechanical force. When it soaks in moving water, the muscle fibers quickly separate, hydrate, and turn to mush. Every natural bait available to anglers has a fibrous structural membrane that is significantly tougher and more resilient than the surrounding meat. On a piece of fresh-cut shad or bluegill, that critical anchor point is the tough skin and the rigid dorsal gristle running along the top of the bait. On chicken liver, the anchor point is not the dark red organ meat, but the thin, translucent connective tissue and gristle that holds the lobes together. If your hook point does not physically pass through that specific, tough membrane at least 2 separate times, you're relying entirely on luck to keep your bait attached. The practical test in the field to verify your rig is the manual pull test. After you rig your bait, hold the eye of the hook tightly with one hand and pull the bait firmly down toward the bend of the hook with your other hand. If the hook easily slices through the meat like butter, that presentation will absolutely not survive the violent acceleration of a 70-foot cast. If the bait meets hard, rubbery resistance and stretches slightly without tearing, it is structurally locked in and ready to be thrown. But successfully finding and utilizing that tough membrane brings up the third and most dangerous question of the entire sequence. Does the way you secured the bait completely block the functional gap of the hook? This is where the most heartbreaking and frustrating mistakes happen on the riverbank during a catfish trip. An angler gets tired of losing their soft bait, so they intentionally fold a massive chunk of cut bait over the hook 3 or 4 times to secure it. They bury the point and the entire bend deep inside the mass of the meat, so it absolutely will not fall off during the cast. The bait survives the cast perfectly, and it holds in the heavy current perfectly without washing away. A 30-pound channel catfish tracks the scent trail upstream, locates the source, and aggressively clamps down on the presentation. The angler sees the rod tip bury toward the water, reels down to set the hook, and pulls back nothing but a mangled, crushed piece of bait. The hook completely failed to set because the sharp point and the critical gap were completely choked by the dense mass of the bait itself. Catfish do not nibble or take small, delicate bites when they are actively feeding on the bottom. Fisheries biologists have documented that catfish rely on an incredibly high density of external taste buds, heavily concentrated on their barbels, to locate food in zero visibility environments. Because they map their environment chemically, once they commit to the strike, they inhale the entire bait instantly using negative water pressure. When that hook enters the interior of their mouth, the exposed point needs to immediately slide and catch the tough cartilage at the corner of the jaw, especially if you are using a circle hook. If the essential gap between the hook point and the metal shank is completely filled with scales, dense meat, and gristle, the hook slides right back out of the fish's mouth like a smooth, round pebble. The permanent solution to this problem requires a fundamental change in your rigging mechanics, not just a change in the type of bait you buy. You have to completely decouple the physical act of holding the bait from the mechanical act of hooking the fish. The most reliable, professional way to achieve this separation on the bank is by using elastic bait thread. Bait thread is an incredibly thin, highly stretchy spool of synthetic material that you wrap tightly around the bait and the straight shank of the hook. It is virtually invisible in the water and requires no complicated knots. It simply grips itself securely under its own elastic tension. When you incorporate bait thread into your setup, you can take the softest, most fragile piece of liver or cut bait, lay it parallel against the straight shank of the hook, and wrap it into a tight, aerodynamic cylinder. The elastic thread absorbs 100% of the violent centrifugal force generated during the cast. The thread also absorbs 100% of the sustained hydraulic drag from the river current once it reaches the bottom. Because the external thread is doing all the physical holding, you're completely free to leave the entire bend and the razor-sharp point of the hook completely bare and exposed. When you execute a heavy cast, the tight, aerodynamic profile of the wrapped cylinder slices cleanly through the air without catching the wind or tearing the meat. When the rig hits the bottom, it presents a highly concentrated, secure scent profile without masking the vital mechanics of the steel hook. And when the catfish inevitably inhales the package, the perfectly bare hook point operates exactly as it was engineered to, finding the jaw hinge instantly and securely. The difference in field results between these contrasting presentations is drastic and immediate. The angler who buries the hook deep in a massive ball of meat has a high bait retention rate, but an incredibly low hookup conversion ratio. The angler who leaves the hook gap exposed but relies only on the fragile meat to hold on has a high hookup ratio but loses their bait on half of their casts. The angler who actively uses the natural membrane or elastic bait thread to bind the bait to the shank, leaving the working gap pristine, solves both sides of the equation simultaneously. Everything we just broke down systematically, finding the current seam, utilizing the anatomical membrane of the bait, protecting the hook gap, and deploying elastic thread, is insufficient if you treat them as isolated, random tips. The complete story here is that these specific variables only work when they align to create a single, unified presentation in the water. A perfectly threaded, aerodynamic bait with a beautifully exposed hook gap will still fail completely if you cast it directly into a turbulent main channel that spins the rig violently and wraps the leader around your main line. A perfectly located current seam will still yield 0 landed fish if your bait is choking the hook gap, causing you to miss the only massive strike of the entire night. The true secret to keeping your bait on the hook and actually converting that bait into a landed catfish is not a single specialized product or a hidden magic trick. It is the deliberate, thoughtful alignment of your physical location, the hydrodynamic profile of your rig, and the mechanical exposure of your hook. When the water dynamics, the bait structure, and the hook geometry are all telling the exact same story, the system becomes nearly flawless and the results become predictable. You have probably already tried every bizarre gimmick in the book to keep soft baits on your hook, from wrapping them in pantyhose to stuffing them in mesh bags, only to find they cost you strikes or foul your gear. If this breakdown fundamentally shifted how you look at the physical mechanics of your catfish rig, there are more videos on this channel that dissect bank fishing with this exact same level of practical detail. There are no magic rigs sold here, no expensive sponsored gear required, just practical, physics-based ways to read the water accurately and catch more fish. Subscribing is simply the easiest way to make sure you do not miss the next breakdown when it gets published. On your next catfish trip to the river, leave all the complicated, gimmicky rigs at home. Bring one reliable rod, one specific type of soft bait, and a single small spool of elastic bait thread. Walk the bank until you find 3 highly visible current seams where fast water meets slow water. Wrap your bait tightly to the shank of the hook using the thread, ensuring that the gap and the point remain completely bare and unobstructed. Test the current with a sinker first to verify the resting pocket. Then cast your perfectly profiled bait directly into that slack water boundary. That is the entire experiment, and it will change how you fish for catfish for